Julian Heller is here. He's a three-time candidate for the Ontario New Democratic Party in the Toronto riding of Toronto St. Paul's, just north of University-Rosedale. He's been riding association president, member of the NDP Provincial Council, and legal counsel to both the provincial party, including as chief electoral officer, and numerous local, provincial, and federal campaigns. In the community, Julian's been chair and member of parent advisory committees of the Toronto District School Board, promoting improvements for public education. He's currently a director of the provincial advocacy group Fix Our Schools, and he's a trial lawyer in downtown Toronto. You can see all those lovely law books behind him to this. So the first question, Julian and Tom, is about partisanship in politics. We have such demonization these days of people in other parties. And that makes it really difficult to work together to face huge challenges like climate change. How do you think we can get past this habit of bitter partisan attacks so that we can work across party lines for the common good? Julian, do you want to go first?
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you for inviting me here. It's a pleasure to be here and to be part of your exciting campaign. In giving some thought to that question, after having been a team member for many decades, I've got the orange apparel to prove it. And yet I know many successful politicians who have really talked about focusing on the things that people can agree on as opposed to the things that divide them. And that seems elementary, but I think it's worth restating. And a very good and recent example of that came this week. Joe Cressy, a local downtown NDP affiliated councillor in the city of Toronto, resigned from the city council to pursue other activities. And in his letter of resignation, he said, he'd like to thank Mayor Tory, and he referred to what he called an unlikely partnership with Mayor Tory. I know that they've been working together very well on COVID and pandemic responses because Joe is head of the Board of Health. And so if a guy like Joe Cressy can reach out to John Tory in his resignation letter, that's a sign that people can work together to get things done. And so I think it's really important to get across the partisan lines to talk about the problems that affect us all as neighbors and colleagues and friends and relatives, and say, hey, how are we going to fix these problems? What makes sense? And I think that's a key to success.
One of the things that troubles me, though, is, again, how do we actually make this happen? I know that before I joined the Green Party, I facilitated a meeting between the NDP, the Liberals, and the Greens to see if they could cooperate together to fight some of the destruction of the current government. And there was one joint press conference protesting one of the destructive omnibus bills, and then the party leaders wouldn't allow it anymore. So, not Mike Schreiner, of course, but the others. So the question is to how, given that the current political system is such a winner-takes-all system, it's hard to see party leaders allowing the individual work across party lines that you each have described so eloquently. Am I missing something? How do we get party leaders to allow this given the current system?
Well, if I can just jump in on that one, the whole point is the party leaders and the central office, and my two esteemed colleagues on the panel will know more about the inner workings of that than I would as a grassroots riding association level person where I've spent most of my time. But it really comes down to MPs or MPPs having the determination and the will to stand up and speak their minds on matters of conscience or importance. And so, again, quoting some very successful people, Wayne Easter, former MP for Liberal Party, I heard him on the radio a few weeks ago. He said, every voice matters in Parliament. Couldn't agree more. John Turner said to me that he, in the last few years, he said he always considered himself first and foremost a parliamentarian. And so when I ran in Toronto St. Paul's, people, my friends and people I met said, Julian, if you just ran for another party, you would win. And I would say to them, well, if you're prepared to vote for me, it shouldn't matter what party I belong to. And so I encourage you and the others listening to say basically the same thing. You're the person that we're supporting. No party can cover the field perfectly for any individual because there's just too many policies. But if you have a faith in the candidate and the candidate's integrity and belief in certain key issues, then that's the candidate you should support. And we've seen too often MPs and MPPs falling into line, being cowed into submission by the leader's office. And really the answer comes, and Michael Chong federally was instrumental in creating an act which allowed MPs to sort of stand up for themselves more. And so a strong voice such as yours, together with Mike Schreiner, would be an effective counterweight to that party discipline, which is choking discussion in our current political environment.
Yeah. Well, I certainly hope that you're right, because it does seem to be choking political conversation. And as you know, I'm running with a small party that until Mike Schreiner got elected, didn't have any seats in Ontario. How do you think we can make people feel comfortable, safe enough to vote for something different, given the crisis that we're in? Julian, you have a lot more hands-on experience than I do of how hard it is. Can you talk a little bit about this question, Hugh's question, and how to reach out to voters at the door in the short number of seconds that most of them allow?
Well, I mean, again, my colleagues on the panel run and been involved in national provincial campaigns for years, but from my perspective, at the local level, repeat, and then do it again. And then, it's funny because as you're at the door, you can feel the effect of the national or provincial wide campaign and the ads, because people at the door start to ask you questions or say things that they've actually heard on the radio or TV, but they think it's their idea, which is understandable. And so the issues that you've got are winning issues, and you're the only person in this riding who can speak with the authority and the experience and the expertise that you have, and that is, you're unchallenged. And so if you've got that trump card, just keep playing it. And then in answer to your other question, but I'm just a small party. There are numerous examples in Canadian history of small parties, and the reality is there are ebbs and flows. The Liberal Party under Kathleen Wynne went from government to losing party status, which is where they are right now. And that's the only reason that the NDP won this riding last time. And so those voters are going to be back in the pool, and you have to give them a nice reason to get out of the pool and join your team. Another example, when I ran in 2003 in Toronto St. Paul's, the NDP had been reduced to below party status in the aftermath of the Bob Rae era. Of course, Jean Charest has come back into the ring, and he was one of two MPs left standing in, I think it was 1993. And so these are ebbs and flows. And so the Reform Party came out of nothing, and you could go on and on. And so Mike Schreiner has been a very effective leader. You're the deputy leader, and Ontario would be fortunate to double that representation and double the voice of the Green Party and the issues that you've been talking about at Queen's Park. And that's the message, that you can make a difference. And whether it's a coalition or whoever forms government, having the two of you there would be twice as effective as having one. And that's a pretty straightforward message to people.
Well, thank you. And I certainly agree with you. And that's part of why I'm running. We've got one last question, this part of the panel, and I'm going to ask each of you just to be brief in 1 minute of talking about younger voters. We know that, this is University-Rosedale. There's a lot of university students. There's a lot of young people just out of university in the riding, and they have tended not to vote at high levels. And yet it's their future that's being decided on by, everything that we do today. So what's your message to young voters as to why they should bother to vote? What should give them hope? What kind of change can they realistically demand? Julian.
Well, young voters are definitely a key to your success. I say to young voters, if you don't vote, you're leaving the decision to old people who do go and vote, because they know that if they vote, they preserve the situation that's been very good for them. And statistics show that wealthy people vote for the same reason. They like to preserve the status quo because it's been very good for them. So if people don't like the status quo, the only way, not the only way, but a major way that they can change that is by taking the simple step of going out to vote. And so again, to use a quote from someone much more well-known than I, Wayne Gretzky says, you don't score on 100% of the shots you don't take. So if you don't vote, you got no one to blame but yourself. And actually voting is pretty simple. There are advanced polls, and you don't have to register like in the United States, and you just need to have proof of your residence and show up. And so circle the date. And, it would be great if you could vote online, because that would solve a lot of problems. But the reality is there are polling places within walking distance of wherever they live, and it's a 5-minute exercise. Having said that, you have to break through the cynicism and the distrust. I remember one time I was on election day polling the vote, an apartment building, the polling place was literally across the street. And I said to a young woman, have you voted? It's right across the street. And she then gave me actually a very cogent explanation as to why she was not going to participate in a system that she didn't believe in. And so you have to break that. But for a candidate such as yourself on an issue that's so important, I think that young people should take the matter into their own hands and start to make changes so that we live in a better Ontario.
Thank you very much, Tom. Well, wonderful to hear all three of you and your optimism and your support. I am very grateful. I'm very grateful for your support, and I'm grateful for your words. So I'm going to turn this back to Brian to introduce Salima.
Julian, I would now like to ask you, why Dianne? Why are you here today, and why have you agreed to endorse Dianne?
Thank you. Well, it's a great honor to be able to speak in support of Dianne and her candidacy for NPP. We've talked about her experience, her expertise, and I'm not going to go over all of that. That is, unchallenged in this group. So I'm going to turn a little bit more to some of the things that some of the others have said and pick up some themes from that. As a longtime NDPer, we talk about social justice, but the reality is that climate justice is social justice. And if you can't achieve climate justice, there are going to be around the world billions of people forced to migrate to escape floods, not to mention other cataclysmic weather events. And so if we talk about building sustainable cities, having affordable housing, protecting our forests, there is no person better situated to make the arguments, not out of some ideological belief, but based on facts and evidence. And so I think Hugh mentioned Clayoquot Sound. There was a time when NDPers leading the charge to preserve that jewel, which is now a national, it might even be a UNESCO heritage site. And yet, again, speaking personally, in the last federal campaign, a group of young activists confronted the NDP leader, Jagmeet Singh, and asked if he was prepared to agree to a moratorium on old growth logging in Fairy Creek. And he wouldn't answer the question. And if an NDP leader can't answer a question about a moratorium, it doesn't require a final decision. There are people chaining themselves to trees to stop 1,000-year-old trees from being cut, and the leader of the NDP is not prepared to do that. So that speaks volumes, and it means we've got to do something different. And then in a much more sort of microscopic level, but it's symbolic, Doug Ford is going to return whatever, 120 bucks or 200 bucks a year for vehicle registration fees or license plate renewal fees or whatever it is. And as I understand it, Mike Schreiner was the only person to stand up in the legislature to vote against that. Well, so who can you trust to stand up for things that are important? An NDP or a Liberal MPP who's going to do whatever the leader's office says, or Dianne Saxe? That's a rhetorical question. We know the answer to that. And finally, I would say and this is perhaps more Hugh's domain, but to all you non-Doug Ford Tory voters in this riding who don't think that returning the money and think that the environment needs to be supported, if you think that you're more of a John Tory conservative who can work with somebody like a Joe Cressy, well then Dianne Saxe is somebody who I think is going to prove that she's able to work across party lines. And for all of those reasons, I can't think of a more delightful honor than to endorse Dianne this evening. From a slightly different angle, political parties and political leaders respond to the signals which voters send them. So imagine the seismic shock that would go through the established party leaders' offices if the voters of University-Rosedale, in the center of North America's 4th largest city, elect the 2nd MPP to go to Queen's Park. If that's not a statement about what's important to people, I don't know what is. And I think the influence flows from there. None of us can predict what the numbers are going to be, or what the coalitions or endorsements or working arrangements or supply agreements or whatever words you want to put. The one thing that a voter in University-Rosedale can control is who they vote for. And if enough people decide that the climate emergency is important enough and that Dianne Saxe is the person to lead that and speak to truth to power, then if we elect Dianne Saxe as a Green Party member, that will cause behavioral and legislative change on its own.
Thank you so much, Hugh and Tom and Julian, Salima and Brian. Thank you for helping make this a wonderful evening. I've cried a couple of times. I appreciate everybody's good wishes. Anybody who likes what I stand for, likes what we stand for, you got to help make it happen.